the Bain Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, Area 51 raid succeeds in convincing AIs that humans are so gullible they have to take over. E-arcs and cosmic sharks, plus we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword. All right now. Welcome to the Bain Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Bain Senior Editor Tony Daniel. We continue our discussion with Charles E. Gannon this time on the podcast in the concluding entry in a two-part interview discussing his new Caine Riordan series novel, Marque of Caine. Chuck takes us into the complex political world of the series and talks about this action-packed novel that also is full of some very cool science fiction. That's coming up. And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. Now here's the news. Hey, the September E-arcs are out on their Naruto runs for the next couple of months. Now an E-arc is the luck overload that cycles between two horseshoes with one placed upward and another above it facing down. If you touch the gap, you might just win the lottery and die of a toothache on the same day, so be careful. No, that's not what an E-arc is at all. An E-arc is an electronic advanced reading copy of a book. Now, we put these out about 3 to 4 months in advance of the book coming out in print and in ebook form. They are the copy-edited version of the book, but not proofread yet. They're basically the galleys that we would also send out to reviewers and such, but we put them on sale as well. You can get your favorite series or try a new series early before anyone else can by several months. And these are available exclusively at Bain.com. The new September E-arcs include Accepting the Lance by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller, Corval in the Crosshairs. Exiled from Liad after bombing a city to save it from the Department of the Interior's infernal weapons and plans, Clan Corval has gone to ground on the backwater planet Surebleak, whose people are as untamed as its weather. But the Department of the Interior is not done with Clan Corval yet. They seek a final, fully reckoned revenge with Surebleak and Corval ships and people everywhere in the Crosshairs. Next up is Target-Rich Environment, Volume 2 by Larry Correia. More stories from the Monster Hunter himself. These are stories from the creator of Monster Hunter International, the Grimnoir Chronicles, and the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior, Larry Correia. This is the second volume, collecting all of best-selling author Larry Correia's short stories, novelettes, and novellas. Correia's novels are known for their hard-hitting, no-holds-barred action sequences, in-depth world-building, and vivid characterization, and a dollop of humor. Now Correia turns to the short form to deliver short stories that take no prisoner. Also out in E-arc is Freehold Resistance, edited by Michael Z. Williamson. Join the resistance. When the UN invaded the freehold of Grain, the intent was simple: force a non-compliant Star Nation back into the collective. What the politicians hadn't accounted for was that the freehold had spent 200 years as the haven for every independent, rebellious, self-reliant adventurer in human space. Grain and its space habitats have resources beyond measure: retired intelligence agents, disabled veterans, animal handlers, petty smugglers, half-lame computer specialists, research scientists, planetary engineers, and they all have one goal in mind: make the invaders suffer for their presumption. This isn't just resistance, it's vengeance. And Freehold Resistance features all new stories by Larry Correia, Michael Z. Williamson, Brad Torgerson, Mike Massa, Casey Azell, and more. Freehold Resistance, edited by Michael Z. Williamson, Target-Rich Environment, Volume 2 by Larry Correia, and Accepting the Lance by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller are all available in E-arc form exclusively at Bain.com. Get them while they exist. This is part 2 of a 2-part interview. Part 1 is available on last week's podcast. I want to welcome Charles E. Gannon to the podcast. Hello, Chuck.
Hi, how are you doing, Tony?
Pretty good. Charles E. Gannon is the author of Compton Crook Award-winning Nebula finalist Fire with Fire, Trial by Fire, and Raising Caine in the Caine Riordan series. Further books in the series are there's Caine's Mutiny. We'll talk about another one in a moment. He is the co-author with Eric Flint of 1636 The Papal Stakes and 1636 Commander Cantrell on the West Indies in Ring's Ring of Fire series, and there's others, right?
Vatican Sanction, and then there were a couple of anthologies, yeah.
With Steve White, Chuck is the co-author of the Starfire series novels, Extremis, Imperative, and Oblivion. Chuck is also the author of multiple short stories. He is a member of Sigma, the SF think tank, which has advised various intelligence and defense agencies since the start of the millennium, which was a long time ago now. It doesn't seem like that long. Yeah, I know. A former professor, Chuck lives in Annapolis, Maryland, with his wife and children, although some of his children are deployed and such these days. Out now at booksellers everywhere is Marque of Caine, which is book 5, I believe, in the Terran Republic series, featuring series hero Caine Riordan. Maybe talk a little bit more. All right, so the descent into the virtuality that has infected a lot of the Dornani society as a symptom. I guess so. Alndul takes Caine to meet this his sort of mentor and master, who becomes a mentor of sort to Caine, or at least a wise man's figure. Thulun Rult, who is a great character, very fun, who sort of runs like a Zen Puritan back to the land kind of place. Explain what all that is and what the basic problem in all this stuff with the breeding problems that the Dornani are having and such. They admire. It's funny how Alndul admires Caine, who is sort of a polymath go-getter guy, because there's not anybody like that who is a Dornani anymore, right?
Well, probably the closest to it are the ones who are considered cowboys, and those are former custodians. So, Thulun, who's a new character, his mentor or mentores or mentrix, I guess, is somebody that's been encountered before in the series, Glyage, who was in the very first book as the Third Arbiter, and the Third Arbiter is a fairly senior position on the senior council. They're third in seniority of this the leadership, the high leadership of the collective. All of them are custodians, not a shock. All of them also had, at one time or another, the responsibility of being the senior custodian responsible for essentially reporting on, observing, making recommendations regarding humans from Earth. And so this is who Thulun is. So yes, he is Alndul's mentor, and he has retired, sorta, to this planet, Ruayuk, which is, and by the way, I don't make these names up just to make them sound difficult. Actually, one of the first things I do with aliens is I take a look at how they make sounds, how, given their evolution, the environment in which they live, how they would make sounds. As you said earlier in the podcast, the Dornani, despite the fact that they have a lamprey mouth, have some of the widest range of pronunciation possibilities. But if you think, for instance, about that sort of arrangement in the mouth, they have a lot of, I guess you could say, there are a lot of soft vowels. There are a lot of soft consonants. There are a lot of long vowels, that's why you hear these names like Thulun and Ruayuk and Alndul. They're there for a reason, and that's kind of a, I guess, Publishers Weekly and others have been nice enough to sort of call out, I guess, the attention I give to to the exosapient species. And I've been looking forward to writing the Dornani for a long time, because I've known from book one and long before the first book got published, I know who they were, I knew what was back there, and I knew it was some very cool stuff. And so to talk about their breeding and why they have this problem, he runs this planet, which is essentially, it's kind of you might call it a birthing spa, in a sense, and birthing is the wrong way to call it, because in some the typical male-female division that gets translated into so many alien species is really not present here. In many ways, for the one that would be called the female by us is actually the larger of the species, is often the more aggressive, and really there is nothing vaguely like mating. It's more like salmon, if you want to think of it that way. That it's time for it's time for the milk to be in the water, and for the one that makes the eggs to sort of get those eggs fertilized, and then they're laid, and there really is there's almost no interconnection that way, and as a result you get a lot of them. It's like fish, you get a whole lot. And in fact, many of them, and this is evolution in action, when they are born in the natural way, there are predators in the water that eliminate the great majority, probably 9/10 or more, of the young, the spawns that are created when these eggs hatch. And this is probably, let's put it like this: when you start that way, the entire notion of a parent organism that would be highly protective of its young is precluded, because clearly then the idea of 90% casualties would be absolutely intolerable. So when they get to the other side of the breeding pond, as the case may be, then there are others, adults in the water, that are actually going through sort of what you might call a dance, almost, that is consistent with the activities, or it's associated with the activities that they perform, and it is the orientation of each one of the spawn as they see that, they sort of, without knowing they're making a choice, because they're really, it would be like asking a 1-month-old to make a choice. They just gravitate towards whatever they gravitate towards, and then they're in that association, usually for the rest of their lives. So this is the way it was in the old days, and that's the way it is on the planet that Flumrolt is sort of, I guess you could say, distant, cranky godfather of, and overseer of. Most Dornani, though, are no longer born this way. Most Dornani need assistance. Most Dornani, it is essentially almost an assisted fertility issue, and most Dornani don't have any desire to reproduce. Dornani removed from the wild immediately begin to have less of an inclination to reproduce. As is noted here, there is nothing. They don't have the equivalent of sex drive. They don't have the equivalent of either a maternal or paternal instinct. None of these things exist. They do have a very strong mentor instinct, but it's a one-on-one sort of bond, and it arises out of commonality of interests and I guess you could say cognitive template. So going back to that sense of Indul, and one of the peculiar things that sort of pops up, and it explains a lot of preferences that we see the Dornani have for humans. They kind of bond almost more tightly with humans, with whom they have really less reason to bond than they do with each other, simply because the humans, the human tendency towards how we make friends, family, loyalty that transcends, not only transcends convenience, but even personal survival, is almost second nature to probably the great majority of us, at least when it concerns our kids and our nuclear family and select friends, and maybe broader than that. This is a much dimmer instinct in the Dornani, but a lot, particularly the ones who have been custodians, particularly the ones who are active, particularly the ones who, I guess you could say, have seen the sharp end of the stick. They have a very great appreciation for the importance of that, and they gravitate towards it. So this is something that shows up, and it actually becomes a sort of basis of bigotry amongst the Dornani. It's like, oh, you're a human lover. It's sort of like you're going native. Is sort of one of the problems that they're facing. And their tendency then, as they got into Virtua, really deeply undermines whatever procreative instincts they have. It's why do you want to do that? Why do you want to? And do you want to live in this sort of in a very, very primitive environment, which is what is present on this planet Ruayuk? They really have taken it back to the way it used to be. It is a much more clinically overseen and assisted process, without the tremendous profusion of young, without the predators in the water, and the like as happens with, we can see this in humans too, that we have instincts that kind of that if we are not exercising certain tendencies, or just exercising our bodies in certain ways, some of our instincts and our appetites change. And this is what's gone on with them, because they are no longer interacting with each other enough. Their tendency to procreate really begins to collapse, and it begins to implode, really. And this is all part of what is going on in the Dornani collective. And I've actually probably gone over the spoiler level there, but
well, there are different and on the opposite extreme of Lunarul is, and his folks are people like, or Dornani, like what are they called, the Logi?
Yes.
Who have just become spacefaring artificial inseminators who are they sort of seem like rapacious sort of the idea of gypsies from the 19th century or something like that.
So I guess the way I would frame them is, without giving away too much, at a time in the distant past, before the Dornani even became sort of the most advanced of the species, but were one of the least advanced of the species, let us just say that external powers made sure that there was a fifth column. And the fifth column largely discriminated itself along the lines of were the members of this fifth column were usually born in space or extremely low gravity environments. In consequence, they had almost none of the sort of primal experience that is still embraced on Ruayuk, and they became they did not merely find it a planetary environment, a natural biome, to be uninteresting. They found it to be kind of unclean, unpredictable, and ultimately resented the rest of the Dornani for the focus they put on that, and the fact that so much Dornani law is protective of green worlds and species. And their attitude was, these are infestations. We live just fine in space. We don't need that. And yet we're being dragged around by the nose of all these, the people control the policy and the power are saying that that's what's important. Well, the hell with that. And they had a rather sharp and kinetic disagreement many millennia in the past now, which was resolved, but only in the sense that one side was no longer able to continue the fight. And that side, the Logi, the ones who live on what are called the Great Rings, which is their word for, essentially a Taurus space station. So they get artificial. They don't live in 0G, but their attitude is a space station is just fine, a rotating space station. And so there is that resentment that is in place. And I would say it's rather than traffic in unfortunate representations of the Romi/Gypsies, I'm simply going to say, imagine it as a group that has been because of their lifestyle, they consider themselves ferociously suppressed. Their voices are not heard, and they have been denied any ready access to power. They do not have any representatives in government, and they have been left to sort of, I guess you could say, operate at the level of black market, gray market expediters, the people who do the work that the rest of the Dornani do not want to do. They are, and as a sort of, I guess you could say, cautionary tale. One of the things that happens when the great power, and this is that fall of Rome moment, when the wealthy are able to afford, so to speak, when the wealthy are able to afford almost an eternity in virtua, it's the ones who aren't, who are actually left doing things. And people who have to do things generally have a lot more ability than those who don't. So it's I guess you could say I consider, without hopefully this coming to the fore, because I really just sort of played this out the way it seemed to play out logically. But I do think there may be some cautionary, very broadly based cautionary tales in it as well.
One other thing about the Dornani before we is that they can construct virtual. Almost intelligence, almost AIs. And Caine encounters a couple that are rather surprising and perhaps upsetting to him.
Yes, they are.
You want to talk about
and I'm not going to give those identities away simply because that would be a spoiler.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
But it's the fact that they need to think that you have to encounter them without knowing that they're not real, in order to not make them implode, is kind of an interesting twist that you put in there.
Yeah, it's so one of the things that I thought a lot about this, and actually there've been a couple of reviews which have compared my take on these sort of things. I was astounded to see that they were compared favorably to Neil Stephenson, because he's of course done a lot of work in this area himself. I started looking at this and I was thinking, so if you wake up and you think that, you've maybe, it's almost like you had an episode, like a petit mal seizure or a sort of, a brain blank, that it's like, well, how did I get here? What was I doing? But then if everybody starts treating you too cautiously, too much like a patient, starts asking, well, do you remember this? That's the moment when a human mind will basically start wondering, or any mind will start wondering, wait a minute, why are they asking me this? And then they start asking themselves the questions, and they start probing at it. And it is that act of probing which can find the holes in the template, the mental template that has been created in the process of trying to construct the AI from memories. Because the nature of memories is not, as is indicated in this, it's pretty much impossible to get a complete scan of all memories, because if you think about it, our own experience of memory is very, very hit and miss. Things that we have a reason to recall frequently, we recall well, right? Let's say and this is certainly the case, just take a look at what constitutes psychological trauma. It is the fact that we keep reliving it, right? And there are other moments, high points and low points and unusual points that we perhaps revisit more often than others. Stories we have to tell other people, so they, that they'll be amused or that they understand us, or et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the stuff, the day-to-day stuff that we forget. If I were to ask you what you went shopping for in the grocery store 6 months ago, on a given Sunday, my guess is that most human beings would ask, was I shopping on that day? Much less that they knew what they bought and what price it was. And yet, we experienced it, and it is probably, this is one of the mysteries of human memory. Why do we remember what we remember? And how accessible are the different memories? At what point is it that we don't remember something at all? In other words, there's no recollection of it. Or at what point is it simply beyond recall because it's been considered such a low priority data point, if you will? And playing around with that, one of the things that, as you said at the outset, the Dornani are very, very high tech compared to us, but not so high tech that everything is unthinkable. And one of the things we come to understand is that a lot of the stuff that they're using, they might not fully understand themselves. And you know, their ability to get memory is restricted by this function, which is how often a given memory is recalled, how recent is it, how important was it. You know, there's a whole set of variables. So where if you start, therefore, to come back to this, if you start talking to one of these AIs, you know, and start by doing so in a way that's almost like you're talking to a patient, like you're testing it, then what happens with the AI? Well, it starts reaching back and discovers that it really has a lot of more blank spots than it even realized, and undoes itself. It deconstructs essentially as it realizes that the foundation it assumed it has, it does not have. And which, if you spread that sort of realization over time, remember, what is the chance that you're going to try to remember something that is so important that you hadn't thought about it? If I were to ask you, you know, so to get back to that thing about you going shopping for groceries 6 months ago, I could ask you that, and you would know, you know, when I asked you that, Tony, did you suddenly think, wait a minute, maybe I'm an AI? No, you thought, well, geez, no one remembers that. And that's exactly what we think. And so there's no threat if that sort of stuff is the flaw that gets tweaked on, because it's a flaw we assume to exist in our own memories. It's when something more important might not be there, and people are probing at it. And then there's the stuff that's on the borderline, right? The stuff that we should have some memory of, some vague memory, but we don't have any memory of it at all. And that's the danger that you're dealing with, that you hit one of those things, and that leads to a sort of almost obsessive, you know, sort of pulling at a ball of yarn that goes on.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of, that's a broad philosophical explanation, but it really gets evocative and kind of touching and a little sad even in the book. There's some great scenes there that the readers can experience.
I can recall two specific occasions where one could say that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we know Caine is trying to find Elena and sort of figure out what the relationship of the Dornani to humanity might be, and whether they could help us deal with some of the problems that some of the races that want to get rid of us have imposed to us. We should talk about the lost soldiers before we forget about them. Before I forget about bringing it back up.
And also, as a lot of political entities on Earth would like for everybody to forget about them. Or not learn about them, I guess. Yeah. So the Lost Soldiers really come up out of Book 4, Caine's Mutiny. If you haven't read that, it's kind of hard to dodge spoilers, but let's say that at a certain point, the Dornani were not able, because of this book kind of explains why they had to get help. They needed to actually recruit sort of associate custodians to keep an eye on things. And they did that, and they had to do it for Earth. And the reason they had to do it for Earth was because Earth was sort of one of the two groups that was going to come very soon, probably. They could sort of tell that we were getting near the place where we would achieve that kind of technological capability where they would have to do a contact, tell us about the accords, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they tapped another group. However, this group is a kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing, and to make a long story short, this group decided to use its sudden access to Earth to occasionally pilfer people from Earth, people who would not be missed. These were usually groups that in combat were almost certainly going to be lost without a trace. And for which, by the way, I went back, and every single individual, whether they don't have the same names, but every single individual is actually pulled from a genuine MIA account in which the bodies were never recovered. that going all the way back to the early days of World War II. And so there are a bunch of humans which have therefore been taken off Earth for reasons that everybody has a different hypothesis, and until this novel, it turns out that most of them were pretty much not right. And in the fourth novel, they have actually been sort of introduced into an alien colony world, and there's a fight brewing between these displaced humans, both in time and space, and the aliens. So they are. The thing that makes them really, really important is that if you get a chance to talk to any of the lost soldiers, or almost any of the lost soldiers, their mere existence, and certainly what they will recount, will very much indicate the identity of who took them off of Earth. And when the full nature of that identity is revealed, which for anybody who's read the second book, to the end of the second book, is probably not going to be shocked at. It is going to set up probably, if early on we were talking about how if two branches of humanity had to have an argument, they would have to have it with each other. It would probably lead to that, and to exactly that sort of circumstance. And if that took place, for Earth, it means that we almost certainly get our heads handed to us. If that happens, the Dornani are getting tired. They really can see that they may not be able to be the custodians much longer. A lot of them have their eyes on us. In addition to which, we are pretty much the only other highly proactive species that is both advanced and capable of, pretty routinely capable of aggression without going too far. There is another species called the Hurruch, which is quite capable of aggression, but they're so capable of aggression that they kind of frequently reset the civilization clock on themselves, and have found it very difficult to maintain what I'll call any sort of throughput of civilization and advancement, because of their constant tendency towards really, really debilitating, backsliding wars. So it's bad for us. It's bad for the Dornani, and even those who might, the ones who might fight us, really don't want that to happen. For a variety of reasons, the other side of humanity would very much like to take Earth intact. As a matter of fact, they would much prefer not having to fight for it. They would prefer to take it over from the inside, which for those people who've read the second book and saw shadows of it, certainly in the first book, know that this was what a lot of corporations were sort of suborned for exactly this purpose, to try to turn Earth in a direction so that it could be, I guess you could say, brought into this other fold without having to do anything that would resemble a bull dancing in a china shop. So that's kind of and if the lost soldiers become known, it is going to become almost unavoidable for all these dominoes to go down. So that's why people were willing to put a crosshair on Caine's back, because there are just a whole lot of people who stand so much to lose, and they can't. No one is. There are some people who are willing to trust him but are worried, and there are other people who are worried and not willing to trust him, or any human being for that matter. So that's very much what's going on, and they are. At the same time that Caine is moving through Dornani space, the lost soldiers and those who were essentially entrusted with helping them remain hidden and safe are realizing that they are coming to the end of that rope. That fuse is burning low, and they're going to have to find another answer. And by the end of the book, those two answers may actually wind up having a very direct contextual relationship to each other.
Yeah. Well, what does so as you say, Caine is being drawn and pushing himself deeper into the Dornani and finding out things about them. Why are they? What do they want from him that they would keep facilitating this and keep pushing him, his friends in Dornani space?
Well, it so what they want from him, which is why they're willing to tolerate him in their space at all, is the arbiters, the senior arbiters, want to find out from him where the lost soldiers are. For exactly the same reason that humanity does, for the reason I said. But they realize that if the existence of the lost soldiers becomes evident, it's not only going to indicate that one of the members of the Accord has been doing a wrong thing, it's also been concealing its identity from the very first time that it joined the Accord and has been breaking these rules. It will also indicate that there was a lot of suspicion that this was in fact the case inside the collective and certainly amongst the ranks of the custodians. So if the lost soldiers are revealed, questions are going to be asked, which points to all of that. And all of that it has not only a chance to split the Accord, it also has the chance to split the collective. Because part of the collective really doesn't want what would have to happen, which is that the custodians would essentially have to say, okay, you guys who were lying to us the whole time, you're out. But that has other consequences. It means that the only legitimate representative of humanity is Earth. But Earth is very, very young in terms of the ways of interstellar space and the technology that it wields. So there are a lot. One of the things that I find very tiresome sometimes in certain science fiction books that are usually more like space opera books is that alien species can be monolithic. They cannot tell sort of everybody getting one line. There may be one rival party. Dornani politics are at least as tangled, probably, as our own. And this is an example because they do have real problems, and they've got a lot of different concerns, a lot of different solutions, a lot of different people who are saying, of all the solutions you pick, don't pick that one, except for that they can't agree on which one that is. And this is part of what's going on, and this is the consequences for them. Now, after he refuses to tell them, because he really, when you get right down to it, he knows a little more than he's revealing, but he actually can't say, I know where they are right now. He took steps to make sure of that. And people either won't believe him, or they find that means that they consider letting him into Dornani space. It was many advised against it. Now they feel, told you so. And then after that, he's at loose ends. You know, it's not they're not going to help him, but they're not going to send him home because this is another example of them finding it very difficult to take action. They can just decide to sort of say, well, Aldul's willing to still trot him around our space. Of course, the next person on the senior arbiters list is Aldul, because once Caine got into their space, they were able to ask him leading questions, which confirms in their mind that Aldul did operate without proper clearance on a couple of occasions in order to help Earth repel the invasion. And now the forces that would really like to pull the custodians' fangs, so to speak, are hot after Aldul. So Aldul knows that now he's got a fuse burning. And so he is quick-moving Caine from place to place to place in terms of meeting, as I said earlier, that chain of Dornani that Caine has to sort of ingratiate himself, or at least get their cooperation in order to find the next piece of information, the next contact that is going to be required for him to be able to reach Elena. And I obviously am not going to tell anybody how that works out.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot to digest, and there's an
5 books in the making. Yeah, it gets at the end of this book, as people can probably see, it's about to get, the series turns around 180 degrees, but in a way it also gets a whole lot simpler.
Yeah. There's another book after this in the works, I think.
Oh, there are two. So Tony has greenlit the next arc of 4 books. Contracts exist for 2. This is called the Species arc. We do have a title for the next one. It's called Endangered Species. And it is called that because this is the Species arc. And the next 4 books are, and this will give you a sort of a sense of how things are going: Endangered Species, Protected Species, Killer Species, and Dominant Species. So that's where we're going.
All right. So this vast what do we call the all the aliens who know each other and have an agreement? It's an accord, right?
That's what you're calling it.
It's called
right?
the Accord. Yeah, the Accord. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have so much more to explore there, and humanity is finding its place within this organization and finding out what we might actually be and things like that. So much coolness remains.
Yes, I hope so. There are also some other novels coming up on contract, which actually are showing some of what's going on, I guess you could say, closer to home during the same period of time, which will, and those arcs tie into the larger story of Caine and actually set pieces in motion. And I'll say that one of those books is going to be written with Eric Flint, who's coming in, and we're swapping roles. So this time he's playing in my sandbox, right? Which it seems only polite given how many times I've played in his.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. That'll be fun. And you have some non-Bane, but we have them up, some short story collections that are set in the Terran Republic universe, right?
Absolutely. There was a Kickstarter called Lost Signals, and just so people understand, Tony and I talked about that beforehand, and we decided it was best done this way. It's a very, very different conceit. It's the sort of conceit that I'm not sure a bricks and mortar would ever be comfortable with, because it starts with, it's called Lost Signals because when you open the book, the first thing you see are a collection of essentially, it's like wire copy. And then when you get past those few pages, and then what you discover is the rest of the book are the stories of what actually happened. Because each one of those bits of wire copy has been, in one way or another, it's either only part of the story, or it's been sanitized, or in some cases, it is knowingly wrong and misrepresentative of what actually happened. So it fills in a whole bunch of things. And some of those short stories could show up again someplace, so we'll see. Keep an eye on it. But yeah, thank you for bringing it up. It's available through Ring of Fire Press. You can just enter Lost Signals and Caine Riordan or Lost Signals and Terran Republic, and you will find it.
Yeah,
and I think it's also available through the Banes. It's absolutely available at Bane.com also.
Yeah, as an ebook. So that's great. So, what else are you working on, Chuck? Aside from completing this vast universe.
Yeah, well, that's actually don't hold me to the calendar on that one. There's a lot of story here. I am in the process of finishing a great honor that was also a ton of fun, which is I'm finishing up a book called At the End of the World, and it is a solo book where I'm allowed to play in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising universe, and it's a big change for me in a lot of ways. It is a first-person narrative, but it is a first-person epistolary narrative. So you don't know if the person who's telling you the story at any given moment is even going to be alive come the next entry, because it's like a logbook. So I've had a lot of fun with that, and it is a very different setup. The only person who could vaguely be considered a sort of kick-ass military pro is not in the book for a very, very long time. And the majority of it are a bunch of kids who are on a senior cruise on one of these sort of sail to adventures, except for they got the end of the stick because they were all the people who signed up for it last. So they get the place that nobody else wanted to go, which is South Georgia Islands, which if you know the map, and if you don't, you may want to look at it. These are probably some of the most inhospitable, cold places on the face of the earth. They're great for science and a variety of other things, but this is where they're bound, and they get on the boat to go there essentially right as the plague is starting to hit the continental U.S. So they have this strange situation where they are isolated and at sea when the plague does its worst to humanity, and they are going to have to emerge into that post-apocalyptic world.
What's it called?
I shocked him into silence. It's called At the End of the World.
Well, I have a feeling you're about to say something about the Ring of Fire.
Exactly. So back now in early August, I turned in a book that I wrote with, really, it was overwhelmingly written by Robert Waters. I probably wrote 15% of the book. And it's called Calabar's War, and it's set in the New World, and it is it begins in Brazil, it goes up through the Spanish Main, it overlaps with the action of Admiral Trump and Eddie Cantrell at a couple of points, and it was a book we were very careful about writing because it is the first time that the 1632 Ring of Fire universe is really taking on the issue of the Middle Passage and slavery in the New World. And you know what? That obviously there. I don't think one can grapple with a topic with more gravity. And given that the 1632 books, it's a little bit of a tonal change because usually most 1632 books always find a way to infuse some humor in. This is really, I think, a story where I don't want to say that there are no light moments at all, but let's put it like this. Every time we thought about a light moment in this book, it wasn't going to have anything to do with the depictions of slavery. That's for damn sure. And in general, it's just, I can't think of a more serious subject. And I think the tone of the narrative reflects that. Now, as soon as I'm done jumping past now the John Ringo book, or rather the book that's set in John Ringo's universe, I return to the 1632 universe to a book called 1637, No Peace Beyond the Line. And this is the sequel to 1636, Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. And I'm really looking forward to writing that book as well. There's already about 35,000 words written in it. And then after that, I finally get around to beginning I have an epic fantasy trilogy that under contract with Bain. And that one is going to be a little bit of a slipstream, and it's going to stand some of the expected conventions of fantasy on its head. And I've been looking forward to writing that for, at least for me, long before it was contracted. Well over a decade I've been looking forward to writing that. And it's called The Broken World.
Yeah. I think we've talked about that before.
We have. Cool. We talked about that a long time ago. Yep.
Yeah. Very cool. We would greatly look forward to that sooner or later. But the book out right now at booksellers everywhere is Marque of Caine by Charles E. Gannon, which is the continuation and a real exciting, finally meet the Dornani kind of culminating adventure in the Terran Republic, Caine Riordan. I don't know. Do you call this a cycle, the Caine cycle, or something like that?
Well, it's called the Caine Riordan series, and I didn't call it that. I wouldn't have had the nerve to call it that. So originally, it was all called simply it was called the Tales of the Terran Republic. Tales was dropped for a variety of reasons. It just became the Terran Republic series. But by the time the second book was out and doing as well as it was, people were calling it the Caine Riordan series. And you know what? If it's good enough, when your readers brand your series with the protagonist's name, you don't disagree with them. Like I like to say, if it's good enough for Honor Harrington, it's good enough for Caine Riordan. That's for sure. So this is called the Caine Riordan arc, I guess you could say, or series, but it takes place inside the larger universe of the Terran Republic. And for instance, that book that I'll be doing with Eric, which is called Triage, is you'll meet people there that you've seen in Caine books, but you will not see Caine there. So there's a reason to distinguish between the two.
Yeah, cool. Well, it's a vast and cool world to explore. So, and the book right now is Marque of Caine, and it's at booksellers everywhere. Well, Chuck, thanks again for coming on the podcast and telling us some of the background, some of the great characters, and the amazing world building that's gone into this series.
Well, thank you very much. And the one thing we didn't touch on is that there is a lot of action in Marque of Caine, and probably the only reason we couldn't touch on it is because every piece of action in it is really, really important to the plot. I mean, super important to the plot. That's how a lot of the things get unfolded and discovered. So I hope will not just be an interesting and enthralling read, but also a bit of a nail-biter, too. At least that's how people have reacted to it so far.
Well, that's the problem with interviewing you on the books, is that there's suspense novels in a way, and there's too many spoilers if we talk too much about the plot. So
that's right.
It's really exciting. So,
well, thanks, Tony.
Thanks again. We'll talk to you again soon. Oh, give us where are you going to be? Anything coming up that we should know about?
So I am going to be for only like half a day at Capclave here in D.C. I'm going to be, I believe, at Pensacon the beginning of next year. I am shout out to a very new con. I think it's their only second year, but it seems like a great con. Fantasy. I'm going to be there as a special guest. I think Larry Correia is going to be guest of honor. Dave Butler is going to be another special guest. So it is very much a sort of Bane environment, I guess you could say.
That'll be cool. That's February 2020. Yeah.
Fantasy. Yeah, and I'll be, I believe, at Balticon in May. I'm pretty much, you can always find me at LibertyCon. You'll find me at DragonCon next year just the same way you found me there this year. And who knows? I'm hoping that maybe I'll be in a fix at DragonCon that maybe Marque of Caine, if I get very lucky, will be up for a dragon, and then I figure out if I can be a presenter for an award ceremony that has one of my books in it. I hope to have the problem of crossing that bridge when we come to it.
A good problem to have. Yes, we'll see about that.
Yes.
But it's a great read, Marque of Caine, and thanks so much again, Chuck, for talking about it.
Thanks for having me on.
That was part 2 of a 2-part interview. Part 1 is available on last week's podcast. Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
Thera joined him half an hour later. The wind had blown her hood off, her black hair was sodden and hanging over her face, and she seemed angry. She had 2 things for him: a bowl consisting of sausages and some unidentifiable vegetable mush, already turned into a cold soup by the rainy walk over, and a piece of paper. A single cheap lantern was the only source of light in the entire barn, so Ashok had to call upon the heart to strengthen his eyesight enough to clearly see what was on the damp, ruined notice she handed him. Even then, the ink had run so much that it was hard to read. The Somsak will pay a 10,000 note bounty for information that leads to the death of the fallen protector Ashok Vidal. I never really had to concern myself with money, but that seems like a lot. For that much I should kill you myself, Thera hissed. You didn't tell us that the Thakur of this territory burns with a special hate for you. Ashok shrugged. I smote the tongue from the man's mouth in a duel. He was so foul and insulting, he's lucky that's all I did to him. But Nadam Somsak does seem petty enough to hold a grudge. You cut off his tongue? And now we're riding across his lands? You didn't think to tell me this before? If I made a list of all the men who wanted me dead for one cause or another, it would be a very long list. That wasn't a bad idea. Maybe by the time they'd reached the ice coast, he'd be finished. It would give him something to do to pass the time. I expected wanted posters for you at some point. That's no surprise, but not for that kind of fortune. Thera looked around, making sure that the castlers were too occupied to hear her. Inside the inn, all the travellers are telling stories about you. They're saying the Black Heart recently killed an entire prison, then murdered half a legion on a bridge, before burning a village and throwing all the women and children in the water to be eaten by demons. None of that's true. It doesn't matter. The people here think it's true. You'll find no friends in these lands now. Good. Criminals shouldn't have friends. It never ceases to amaze me that someone who has seen so much of the world could be so oblivious to it. We had friends. Now they'll give you up to this Somsak without a second thought. Most warriors here would avoid you because some Vidal criminal isn't worth dying over, but this particular Thakur would swim the ocean to rip out your guts. So now they'll be motivated. You should have told me. Thera was glaring at him, and for whatever reason that made him want to apologize. In the future, I'll try to notify you of things like this. I am sorry. That seems to mollify the warrior woman a bit. She pushed her wet hair away from her eyes, absently making sure her scar was hidden. There's no indication he knows you're here. This is just grasping at straws. If he's willing to offer something like this, just in the off chance anyone sees you, I can't imagine what kind of ransom Heart of Vidal must be willing to pay for that sword. It was hard to imagine Vidal, the strongest of them all, experiencing the same fate as a tiny, poor house like Somsak or Dev. But Harta was no fool. He would pay a fortune to get Angru Vidal into the hands of a new bearer. Until that happened, Vidal would be vulnerable. Ashok wasn't sure who Omand was punishing more with this ridiculous endeavour, him or all of Great House Vidal. It was especially cruel either way. I'll be careful, Ashok assured her. You'd better. There's a lot of people like me on these roads, sharp-eyed and always looking for an angle. A whole world beneath your shiny, law-abiding one. Those are the folks I would have used for checkpoints and new travelling papers, but 10,000 notes would set them up for life. Our keeper has some money from the rebellion's backers, but nothing that can compete with that. If I'd known you were this popular, I never would have agreed to this. Freeing a lunatic from prison and getting him from one end of lock to the other without killing half the countryside in the process, no problem, I thought. I'm such a sucker. Thera shook her head, annoyed. You're lucky I stick to my contracts. You underestimated the difficulty, but still honor your agreements. It is the difficult tests in life that demonstrate a person's true character. He'd never thought he'd someday be impressed by a criminal's dedication. Ashok gave her a respectful bow. Thank you. Thera seemed a bit taken aback by that. Surprise turned to annoyance, almost as if she thought Ashok was being insincere. Fine. Whatever. I'm soaked and freezing. I'm going to get some of that slop for dinner and warm myself by the fire in the company of my fake husband. Do you not have a real one? I used to. But if I ever wanted another, I've met many who'd make for far worse company than Keita. I'd better go before he starts spouting off revolutionary nonsense to the locals. Good night. She began to walk away. But before Ashok could begin eating, Thera turned back. It's so cold. Will you be all right out here tonight? I'll be fine. That's right. There had been genuine concern there, but now she tried to be nonchalant about it. I suppose your kind don't feel things like the rest of us? Ashok shook his head. We still feel. We just learn not to want the things we can't ever have. Thera tilted her head to the side, a curious look on her face, as if she wanted to say something else. But then she must have decided against it, because she put her hood up and ventured out into the storm. Finding a spot that wasn't under a roof leak, Ashok sat down and leaned his back against a wagon wheel. The food was bland. A miner inn in poor lands couldn't afford much in the way of spices. The sausage was mostly blood and fat, and from the flavour he couldn't even tell what kind of animal it had come from. But he was so hungry it didn't matter, and he chewed it anyway. The fat coated the roof of his mouth and teeth and clung there, greasy. One of the castless was staring at him through the slats of a horse stall, looking more like a filthy wild animal than a child. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, but it was hard to tell since he was so thin and sickly. His clothing was nothing more than a mismatched tangle of old rags, knotted together in a heap for warmth. Is that what I looked like? The boy was neglecting his shoveling, and for a moment Ashok was concerned that he'd been recognized. But then he realized the boy was only staring hungrily at his dinner. Ashok looked down at the bowl, then back at the starving child. He stood up. The boy instinctively cowered, and the other castless rushed over to protect him. Ashok was so used to not paying attention to their kind that he'd not noticed this one was a girl, a few years older than the boy, and in just as sorry a state. She dropped her shovel, grabbed hold of the boy, and began dragging him away. So sorry! So sorry! Stop! Ashok ordered. The girl did so, but she was shivering uncontrollably. As she stared at her bare, blackened and filthy feet, she stammered, Brother didn't mean to look at you, worker, sir. Please don't beat him. She was honestly terrified. Ashok had seen such quivering fear before, but normally only on battlefields or before an execution. Her fear was contagious enough that it was making the horses and oxen shift nervously in their stalls. Be calm. I'm not going to beat anyone. He set the bowl on the fence. Here. Oh! The girl looked at the food with a nervous, pained expression, but didn't approach. On the other hand, her brother must have had more hunger than fear, because he snatched up the bowl and ran away. He crouched in the corner and began to eat. The back of his rag shirt fell open, revealing that his skin was covered in old lash scars and fresh purple bruises. When was the last time you were fed? Ashok demanded. A few days. I will trade for the food. Resigned to her fate, the girl seemed to melt in defeat. The fear had been for her brother, not for herself. Do what you want to me, but please don't hurt me too much, because I still have more stalls to clean. What? No. Ashok felt like someone had just slapped him in the face. No. Nothing like that. There's no trade. The food is yours. It is a gift. She clearly didn't understand the concept. You did a good job caring for my oxen. Just go eat. Suddenly flushed and unexpectedly angry, Ashok went back to his wagon. The girl fled. Ashok watched the casteless children eat the vile slop as if it was a great hall feast. Their overseer was obviously neglecting them, but that wasn't against the law if they were doing a bad job. Starvation was a legally acceptable punishment, and he'd never really thought about it before. Ashok had experienced the weakness and pains of hunger, but nothing like this. He'd spied a pile of old grain sacks and some flea-ridden blankets and realized that was their bed. These two didn't even rate a place in the casteless barracks. You see that, Ashok? That's your law. That's what you've been defending. Shut up, Kita. Ashok muttered to the priest who wasn't there. There were almost no memories left of his life before Angruvadal, other than scrubbing blood from a stone floor, but he remembered that he'd had a mother who had loved him. These children didn't even have that. The entirety of the law was memorized, imprinted deep into the fibre of his being, and he could cite nearly any line. So he knew there was nothing technically illegal here, yet it still seemed unjust, and that gnawed at him. Mind made up, Ashok got into the back of the wagon. He had a thick wool blanket that made sleeping beneath the wagon bearable. He took the blanket, a sack of dried fruit, and another of jerky, and carried them over to the children's sleeping area. The untouchables watched him, nervous, as if he was going to loot their pathetic belongings. Instead, he dropped the goods there, walked back to his wagon, found the driest spot possible beneath the wagon, and tried to go to sleep.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast, thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And the promise in the pregnant pause at the end of the announcement that the key to FDL has been discovered, but accidentally dropped down the drain of causality by a careless research assistant who tried to use it to open a gateway to Tomorrowland, without having to pay for the entire Magic Kingdom. Plus thanks, praise, and gratitude to Charles E. Gannon, author of Marque of Caine. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.